Remember when we only had 4 TV networks, plus whatever the hell UPN and WB were? You had to be in front of the TV when the show aired, or hoped you had a blank VCR tape. And then if you wanted to talk about what you watched last night, you had to actually, and I can't even believe I'm suggesting this, talk to an actual person, like in real life. The 90s were a whole mood, man, and the Great Pop Culture Debate wants to throw it back and decide what was the best sitcom of the 1990s. Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name, and that's why you'll find me at the VD Clinic. I'm your host, Eric Rezsnyak. Please help me welcome my panel for this episode. In a 90s kind of world, she's glad she's got her girls. It's Amma Marfo.
Keep your head up and let's go.
She's gone from living single to being married with children, and now she'd love the nanny to help with her full house. Please welcome to the podcast, Jennifer Chen.
That intro is the best.
You're the best. I'm so glad you're here. And she's the lady in red when everybody else is wearing tan, the flashy girl from Astoria, the manny named Kevin Dillon.
Mr. Sheffield, I'm here.
Oh, that was a very good Fran Drescher. Thank you, Kevin. So before we get to the debate, how does this work? We made a list of 100 plus notable comedy shows that originally aired on American television between January 1st, 1990 and December 31st, 1999. What a time to be alive. More than 75 people took the poll. We tallied those votes, ranked their picks by popularity, and added them to a bracket. Now we argue about it and insult each other all for your amusement. Want to play along at home? You can head to greatpopculturedebate.com and go to polls and brackets. There you'll find the downloadable listener brackets for this and every episode of our little show. Do your picks match up with ours? Do you think we should eat your shorts? Let us know by dropping a comment on this episode at our website or by yelling at us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And lastly, if you're curious about how we went from the top 32 down to the sitcom 16, become a Patreon supporter of our podcast. Our Patreons at the $5 level or higher get exclusive access to warm-ups / part ones for each episode, in which we work our way through all of the round one decisions. It's like a whole bonus episode for each topic and includes arguments you will not hear anywhere else. And it's only one of our great Patreon perks, so please consider supporting us today. And with that out of the way, let's order some tossed salad and scrambled eggs and get straight to these debates. First up, ultimate number 1 seed, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, is currently down in numbers from the Queens of New York 5 seed, Sex and the City. Amma, explain why we should keep doing the Carlton dance into round 3, while I will rally up the up my ass players for Sex and the City. Amma, I would like you to go first.
I mean, I think there's a reason that Fresh Prince is the number 1 seed here. Like, when you think about a sitcom, a situation comedy that has kind of this endless well of possible opportunities that feel like it fit into that genre, the family element of it, there's so much that the Fresh Prince feels well built for this. So when I think about what constitutes a sitcom and what really feels like the 90s, I think it also does that really well. Like, Sex and the City is a time capsule. It had some moments into the 2000s. So when I think about something that is like quintessentially 90s in so many different ways, Fresh Prince just seems to fit that for me.
Yeah, and I have to say, as I was actually working on my notes for this episode, Amma, I kind of switched my vote to Fresh Prince, and it was partially for the reasons you just mentioned. And I am going to give Jen and Kevin the opportunity to push for Sex and the City, but I want to echo your point there, which is the entirety of Fresh Prince aired in the 1990s. It was all 6 seasons or 7 seasons. It was 1990 to 1996. So I don't remember that 6 or 7 seasons. Whereas Sex and the City didn't start airing until 98 and really had its high points in the 2000s. And when I was looking at this, I was just like, if I was trying to describe these shows, I think I would really think of Sex and the City more as a 2000 show than a 90s show, honestly.
Yeah.
Which is not to say anything about quality, although I do think both of them are very good shows. I think they both achieve what they're setting out to do, and very strongly. Jen, where are you on this one?
I had picked Sex and the City, but now hearing you guys talk about it, I realize you're right. It's more of a 2000s show, and Fresh Prince is so 90s. And it had so many great people in it. Like, I mean, obviously, you know, there's the main star, but everybody else was amazing in it too. I had originally picked Sex and the City because I associate it with that sort of I think the costumes, not costumes, the fashion just feels very 90s to me in Sex and the City, and like has that kind of, Do you remember the first season where it was a lot of like talking to the camera and
Yeah.
like full on, like that feels very 90s of like, let's do reality show type stuff. That's what it felt like to me. So that's why I picked Sex and the City.
Yeah, and that first season is such an outlier for that show because that format goes away very quickly. Like
It was
after
a bad
season 1, it's
format.
gone. And I assume it was based off of the actual newspaper column that it was sourced from. And they're like, let's get everybody's different stories or whatever. But it didn't really work. Kevin, where are you?
This was a tough one for me because it was, for me, it's a format thing. Like, it's a style thing. The style of Fresh Prince is not my cup of tea. I'll be honest. Like, I am not. It had some moments that were a little bit dramatic and a little bit more nuanced, if you will, but it was a little bit more of that 80s slapsticky kind of style. And Sex and the City was the birth of kind of the modern sitcom, if for a lack of better phrase. Like it was just, this was a back and forth that I think I honestly switched between these two probably several times when I was laying it out, and I think I'm ultimately going to go with Fresh Prince in this battle and switch as well. But I want to say, in defense of Sex and the City, the early seasons are incredibly strong because, unlike Ally McBeal, which we talked about in our first episode, Sex and the City has something a little bit different and special that really elevates it. And that goes to the HBO of it all. And there are several podcasts that go into why HBO did what they did and why they are what they are. And it was just so hard for me in this battle. And I do think I am also going to switch to Fresh Prince because ultimately I think it is the best version of that, like, I hate to say this because it was an NBC show, but like TGIF kind of sitcom. Does that make sense?
It does. Did you want to say something? Was someone else jumping in there?
I was just going to say, I get very much what you're saying, and I do agree with you in the sense of, like, there was a sense of a formula of what was driving 90s sitcoms, so a lot of them, even if they're not quote-unquote similar to each other, they have a lot of, like, characteristics. Right. So stylistically, if you don't necessarily enjoy that, that is a challenging thing for something like this. But I also think about, like, what we're here to do is like the best 90s sitcom. That was kind of like the archetype of that era. And I would say that Sex and the City, to its credit, challenges that a great deal, but I think it had a greater impact on the shows that followed it and kind of defined what a successful 2000 show looked like.
Correct.
So its impact kind of hit a little bit later. And as somebody who was also on the 2000s sitcom episode of this program, like that, we're talking about different hallmarks of a show.
Yeah. I would agree with you, and that's why I think I'm going to switch with Fresh Prince, because I think it is definitively a great 90s show. Mm-hmm. It was not necessarily that was one of my favorites per se, but I think it represents, like I said, that best version of a quote unquote TGIF sitcom, and I think it's very good at what it does. And I think it has a great cast. Mm-hmm. My only critique is that we lost the first Aunt Viv, and that is because she was, Jana Hubert was like, man alive, was she fantastic? And the second Aunt Viv, she was good? Question mark.
Sure.
But like that's like a very nitpicky thing. You know what I mean? Like, that's a nitpicky thing, because the cast overall is great. And I think it does a really good job of taking the premise of what is a good sitcom and running with it.
Yep. And we will be moving it to round 3, so we can discuss the War of the Ant Vivs if you want. Then plug. We did talk more about Sex and the City in our best HBO original series episode, which was earlier in this season of our podcast. So do check that out, as well as the best 2000 sitcom, which Amma also mentioned. So my God, look at us! We have all this content. It's unbelievable. Who are we? Next up, in a battle of teen skewing ABC sitcoms, we are evenly split between 3-seed Boy Meets World and 2-seed Full House. Amma, make like Kimmy Gibbler and hound us until we swap our votes to House. Jen, explain why Corey and Topanga were the couple that you cared about. I'm going to have Jen go first.
Okay, I think I admitted this in the previous episode, but I mainly watched this show because I thought the boys were cute in it. So I still go with that vote. I was very much, I'm going to let you know, not a writer strong person. I was more of the older brother. What's Corey's older brother?
Will Friedle.
Yes.
Oh, he was cute.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
And I was like, he's the older brother and he's cute. And anyway, I also thought it was fun and sweet. Like, I liked Topanga and Corey's relationship and the neighbor, Mr. Feeney. And I don't know, it just was a sweet show. It didn't seem like, I don't know. It's funny. I think in hindsight, if I were to go back, I probably watched Full House more as that age, but I just watched Boy Meets World because I thought they were cute. So.
I think that's a completely good rationale for why someone would support Boy Meets World, if I'm being completely honest. It's not like we're talking about either of these shows because of their artistic merits. Am I wrong?
Those are facts.
Those are facts. But that being said, Amma, talk to me about Full House.
So, Jen, like you, I watched both of these. And again, they were like very much of a moment. And going back to what we talked about a moment ago in terms of like the type of format, and even something that I learned about the other day in terms of comedy writing, what's known as like a content factory. So being able to set up a premise that generates its own stories. So like having characters that you get to know a little bit better, and there are episodes about their lives and there are arcs that kind of like run through it in and out. And both shows do that really well. But again, when I think about like 90s sitcom and kind of quintessentially of that era, Full House was a juggernaut. Like the, again, potential that it had to maybe not spin off other shows, but boost other shows by having other characters pass through theirs. And the catchphrases and like what it did for the Olsen twins, just like launched them into stratospheric levels of fame, which we can argue was a good thing or a bad thing. But that show's capacity to like do what it did for them, do what it did for John Stamos. Things like "You got it, dude," "How rude," "Oh my Lanta," like everybody had like their catchphrases. Like it was massive. So when we're talking about like impact on the 90s overall, I think both were good and I enjoyed both, but like Full House's influence on the things around it, undeniable.
I think that's a good point. And I would argue the 90s may be where the sitcom formula like had been so fully kind of baked that it had no place to go but to burst out of those confines. And Full House to me is like a sitcom that is so formulaic. It is firing on all cylinders, right? It's like a perpetual motion engine of a sitcom. It's not great, but it is highly watchable, and it spoke to a very broad subsection of the population, which is ultimately why, and I'm curious for your thoughts on this, Kevin, I'm coming down for Full House here because I feel Boy Meets World, you had to be a very specific age range to really enjoy that program. And I'm actually still kind of gagged that it's a 3-seed on this because it's a very, I think, a very specific niche show. Whereas Full House appealed to kids, it appealed to teenagers, it appealed to parents. And I think it was like genuinely a family show. Whereas I feel like Boy Meets World, you weren't watching that unless either you or one of your kids was between the ages of like 11 and 15. Kevin?
I'm going to be honest. This is a horse race if I don't care.
I figured that was your answer.
You've been quiet enough over the course of this that I was like, you can't have an opinion.
I genuinely think both of these shows are peak fine. Because in the end, I'm going to vote for Fresh Prince between these, whatever wins between these shows. So I'll say this, and I want us to analyze it from this perspective. Like, both of these shows had reboots. Both of these shows
Sure.
have cultural legacies in different ways. And I think the interesting thing about these two shows as they go up against each other is there is something really unique and special about both of these shows in a very 90s way, right? Like they both represent very traditional sitcom kind of perspectives. And I think I went with Boy Meets World, but I think I'm going to switch to Full House. And I hate to support Candace Cameron.
Listen, I understand that pain. I do.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, we're gonna get a Will Smith versus Candace Cameron matchup. And
I welcome that.
I love it. I'm here for it. I'm voting for Will Smith still.
Yeah.
I think the difference is that I think, Eric, you said that someone said the phrases, and that is, I think, what swayed me a little bit. Like the "you got it, dude," how rude. Like there is something transcendent about Full House, early Full House, that really resonates. And the Olsens and the adults, honestly, the adults were just as important as the kids. And that was not the case outside of maybe Mr. Feeney, because in Boy Meets World, the parents were kind of non-entities.
Sure.
So I'm gonna switch my vote to Full House. I think Full House should advance.
And I mean, all the four adult characters on that show actually had long careers. They made a lot of money. Like they did.
And one of them could have gone to jail. So we love that.
We do love that for her. All right. So I'm sorry, Jen. We are going to go ahead and advance Full House.
That's
Next
all
up,
good.
thank you. Most of us preferred the calming voice of radiotherapist Dr. Frasier Crane and 6-seed Frasier, but Jen wanted to push it to the max and go steady with 2 seeds Saved by the Bell. Kevin, why are we out of our minds to not advance Frasier? Jen, break the fourth wall and give us the Zach attack and push for Bell. I'm going to have Kevin go first.
Okay. So I was not a huge Frasier person. In fact, I was very anti-Frasier because I'm so sorry, everyone. We talked about this in episode 1. I was very pro-Friends when I was a kid, but that was because it was simpler and it was simpler times. But I just never got why Frasier won all of its Emmys. But as an adult, I get it. I get it. I mean, Christopher Lloyd and that team spun off Cheers into a show that was intelligent, brilliant, maddening, fantastical, and just genius around a psychiatrist and his family. And I watched several episodes in preparation for this podcast to really just kind of get a smattering or reminding of how great Frasier was and is. And from the pilot and up until Merry Christmas, Mrs. Moskowitz, which is one, I think, of the best comedic episodes of all times, you get to watch Kelsey Grammer, David Hyde Pierce, Jane Leaves, John Mahoney, and she is the rosiest, Perry Gilpin. Just be incredibly funny and dry. It is probably the driest sitcom of the 90s, and it does such a good job of being the epitome of how you take a character from a sitcom that is iconic, Cheers, which we've talked about, and you make something special. You move it forward and you do something really unique with it. And you actually maybe make it better than the original, which is a hard thing to do. And I think that's very 90s, right? Like it's taking something that's very old school and classic and evolving it in a very smart way. And you get to watch all these guest stars play with Frasier. Like you get to watch Gene Smart play with Frasier and be one of his girlfriends. You get to watch him again interact with BB Newirth and have him and her like fight. You get to watch him just have a really great time. And you get to watch David Hyde Pierce play straight, which is a challenge.
Unconvincing is what I would say.
And he's convincing. He does a good job. He's probably one of the best people at it. And it is just it is such a funny show. My God. But like, I have to highlight this. John Mahoney is one of the most brilliant comedic actors of all time. And he's so special. Rest in power, and he is what a terrific man he was, and it's just a lovely show. And Eddie the dog, oh my God, Eddie!
I was literally just about to call you out for the moose erasure.
Yes, no, Eddie the dog, and it's just so funny. It is a delightful show, and it is incredibly special.
I have a huge torch for Saved by the Bell, so this is going to be sort of a soapbox moment for me, but
get on up.
So 90s. It's overly dramatic. There is no subtext. Those special episodes,
very special episodes, absolutely.
Of like, here's drugs, or the special character you're never going to see it again. When like Zach dated for a hot minute like a homeless girl and was like, oh my God, we're going to totally change this family's life, and then you never saw them again.
What's more 90s than that?
Yeah. Thanks for your help. You changed my life. But I also, if we didn't have Saved by the Bell, we wouldn't have had Showgirls.
I love this argument.
Showgirls is its own, it's a gift to all of us if you've never seen it. It also, I was like, I'm so excited. It's such a good catchphrase. That whole meltdown is like, I could watch that every single time and enjoy it. And I also really liked their fake bands that they had, that they would lip sync to like clearly other people had sang these songs, but they were trying to act like they had sung them. It was just so corny. And I feel like in my mind, Saved by the Bell is so 90s because it's that over the top, like nothing is like real, nothing is any real human emotion. I don't know. It's really a cheesy pick, but I love it. Like I cannot love it anymore. It gave us Banana Split Sunday, I think it was, the girl band. And then it also gave us Lark Voorhees as Lisa. It just gave us so many good things.
Technically every member of that cast actually did have some level of pop culture kind of stardom or infamy after that show.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Definitely. And Zach Morris was my crush from like the second I saw him. I was like, I need to follow this guy on any show that he's on. And I feel like he was the cutest 90s boy.
I love that you love sociopaths. I'm really proud for you.
Let me say this, and I hear that argument that Zach Morris is a sociopath. I was trained from a very young age to fall in love with sociopaths, and
many of us were.
I'm so grateful for that. Gaston from Beauty and the Beast. Hello.
Oh boy.
Like there's a long line. My father. No, I'm just kidding. But no, seriously. I agree with Jen's core of her argument, which is that there is no show on this list that is arguably more 90s than Saved by the Bell. I think that is completely true. And here's where I'm coming on this. If Frasier is, and bear with me, the Viennetta, we all know what Viennetta is, right? It was the fancy ice cream cake of the 90s.
I'm with you.
Okay. Then Saved by the Bell is like those little plastic cups of ice cream that you would get in the refrigerator with the plastic spoons. Thank you. It's that, right? Yeah. Both iconically 90s. Which is better? I'm not sure you can actually say that Viennetta is like better. It's just fancier. And I do agree that with Kevin that Frasier is brilliantly written, but it's also kind of condescending, right? Like
But that's the 90s, honey.
It totally is. It's right. That's very true. Like white pretension, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
Both 90s and timeless. Let's just say it.
Yeah, exactly. Amma, spot on.
So true. So I think there is merit to both, is what I'm saying. If I had to make a decision as to which one I'm moving forward, I'm probably going with Frasier, even though there is a deep, deep place in my heart and in other places of my body for Zach Morris, and Mark Paul Gosselaar could still get it to this day. Hands down, no question. But so could Slater.
Mario Lopez.
Mario Lopez, thank you.
Absolutely.
He got better looking after the show, though.
Did.
Oh, I don't know. I love his
Really?
Nambla look.
But like, let's talk Nip Tuck. We never talk about Nip Tuck, like it's been forgotten. But Mario Lopez season 2 of Nip Tuck, check that out, folks. Lots of shower scenes. It is worth the investment of your time. Amma, where are you on this?
So I do think that both of these have like a very special place in the 90s, and I do agree with the argument that Frasier is one that, like, as a kid in the 90s, I was like, I don't understand why this is funny. And then as an adult looking back on it now, I'm like, oh, okay, they're doing something very special here. But to the point I kind of just alluded to, Frasier almost feels timeless in the sense that if someone were to not even reboot it, that's not what I'm talking about, but like make this show now, we'd be having slightly different conversations about it, but it would feel right at home in the 2020s.
Yes.
Whereas Saved by the Bell is such a time capsule, again, not unlike Fresh Prince, of that particular moment, to the point where like the reboot now that's doing really well is doing well because it has to be really different from what it was.
Yeah.
So again, if we're talking about like best 90s, this iteration of Saved by the Bell could not happen in any other time period. Frasier probably could. So for that reason, I'm voting for Saved by the Bell.
That's a great argument. Isn't that a good argument?
Yes.
That puts us into a... are you sticking with Frasier, Kevin?
I sure am.
So... I think that's 2 for Saved by the Bell, 2 for Frasier. Believe it or not, Saved by the Bell is a 2 seed. It would advance.
Y'all are messy. Y'all thinking Saved by the Bell is better than Frasier is messy.
That's not what I said.
That's right.
That's not what I said.
And I think that's very important. And this comes up in the boy band episode from this season, which I'm not going to...
Y'all are messy. And if Saved by the Bell beats... it makes it to the final 4, I am going to literally murder all of you because...
You don't know
it is not a good show. It is ultimately not a good 90s show.
Listen,
I'm just going to say that.
Listen, no one is here to make that claim.
No one is here to make that claim.
No one is here to make that claim.
No one is here to make that. And I think the point is, what is a better 90s show?
I just said if it makes it to the final 4, it is not a good 90s show. It is not a good show.
I don't think you have to worry about that, Kevin. And speaking of which, speaking of messy also, Kevin telepathically made me realize, if you're following at home on the brackets, I skipped a debate because we're recording this at 10 o'clock at night on a Friday. It's been a really long week. But let me go back to that one in what I believe will be a unanimous victory against the patriarchy. 1 seed Golden Girls was the unanimous victor over 4 seed Home Improvement, leaving Tim Taylor without even a crumb of cheesecake. Is anyone objecting there? Was someone going to vote for Home Improvement over the Golden Girls? There you go.
Golden Girls.
So, Kevin, I think you have literally nothing to worry about as we move forward on that one.
I don't know. Jen, I'm curious. I'm worried about you. So I'm just saying.
Oh,
okay.
Wow.
Wait. I didn't say it was the best written show in the world. It's definitely not. It's terribly written. It is so on the nose. But if
it ages worse than milk. Like, it ages like avocado. Like,
it's terrible.
For a minute, and then, oh boy.
But it's really watchable at the gym.
It's 90s.
It is 90s.
It's
All right.
90s.
We are going to move on. I believe we have another unanimous victory, this time for 1 seed Seinfeld, which is sending 4 seed The Nanny back across the river to Queens. Kevin, as one of the biggest Nanny supporters I know, do you want to say anything on behalf of Fran Fine?
It hurts that these two are going up against each other in Saved by the Bell is still in the mix. It genuinely does. It
Kevin,
really hurts.
We're gonna get past that. Like, you have to just.
I know. Okay, so
Saved
the
by
nanny,
the Bell is his CC Babcock.
yeah, the nanny is, I think, I'm gonna say this. I think it's the most underrated sitcom of the 90s, and I think I love, and I say this, it is the queerest sitcom of the 90s, and that includes Will and Grace. It is just so lovely, and it deserves its special place in the pantheon of great sitcoms. It's got everything that I Love Lucy, Laverne and Shirley, it's just so brilliant. It is so brilliant, and I am glad it made it this far, but it is sadly going to be knocked out by a giant.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. It's a Goliath story. Next in a must-see TV showdown, it's 2-seed Will and Grace versus 3-seed Cheers. Jen, explain why you're still gay for Will and Grace. I will raise a toast to Cheers. Wow, I really put a lot of effort into that intro. I took tens of milliseconds to come up with that one, apparently, when I wrote this script. Jen, why don't you talk about Will and Grace?
I'm going to say something that I don't think everybody's going to like, but I didn't like Cheers as a show.
That's okay.
Wild.
That's okay.
But my husband disagrees with me, and he keeps trying to convince me, and I'm like, I don't like it. I liked Will and Grace when it was on, and I think it was fun until it started to just churn out guest stars. Do you remember that at the towards the end, where it was just Britney Spears, Michael Douglas, all this stuff. Anyway, I still love it. I mean, I feel like there's something about it that is memorable to me, to the 90s, and I don't associate Cheers with most of my 90s memories.
And I do think that's one of the big weaknesses that Cheers has, which is that most people are not going to think of it as a 90s show, right? Because I want to say the last 2 seasons were 90s.
Mm-hmm.
3, excuse me, the final 3 seasons. I actually have this in my notes. But I will argue that those 3 seasons were still really good television. And they had some great episodes. I'm almost positive the Jeopardy episode was in those last 3 months, which is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. And I still, to this day, will use the joke in my kitchen, and nobody understands what I'm talking about.
There are people who are not in my kitchen.
Exactly right. It's great. But I think that we have to, and this is, I'm going to get called on this. I've been called on this before, and many other episodes. I'm not saying that something being super popular means that it is better than something else, but we cannot deny the fact that 90 million people, 40% of the entirety of America at that time, watched the series finale of Cheers. It was a cultural thing. It was like when Whitney sang the Star Spangled Banner, Cheers finale. That's to me the two, almost on par with one another. But if you want to talk about guest stars, Will and Grace, let me run down some of the ones that were on Cheers, which also had quite the run. John Cleese, Emma Thompson, Christopher Lloyd, Alex Trebek, sorry, I'm going to go back to that, Arsenio Hall, Dick Cavett, Johnny Carson, Tip O'Neill, John Kerry, and Ethel fucking Kennedy was on Cheers, which I think is amazing.
And don't forget Harvey Firestein.
Right. And seriously, you want to talk about an ensemble cast. That cast was unparalleled. I don't think we've ever had another cast in sitcom history where every single person on that, tell me a weak link in the Cheers cast after Coach is gone.
Nobody.
You swap in Woody for Coach. It is. And even after you lose Diane and bring in Rebecca, still just as good. It is a great, great ensemble cast. I don't think, maybe Arrested Development, maybe, but I'm not even sure I'd go that far. Amma, where are you on this one?
I'm giving it to Cheers. And again, I feel like some of this too, in the same way that there were really good Cheers seasons in the 90s, even though it is largely an 80s show, I think some of Will and Grace's better work was in the 2000s.
Interesting. I always think of Will and Grace's best seasons as being in the early years.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
I don't know.
It's
we can litigate that another time.
We absolutely can.
So I'll say this.
Can't have.
I think you're mostly right because it's tough. Here's the thing. Cheers actually really never had a weak moment. Like,
Right.
And that's rare for a sitcom that lasted, 12 years? Something around that. Like,
I don't think it was 12. It was, I think.
It was
8,
1984 to 2000 or 1992.
So it was 8.
8, yeah.
8. Well, still 8 years. 8 years. Still a really good run.
Sure.
And consistent to the point I think you're about to make. And I don't feel that Will and Grace was that consistent.
Sure wasn't. And those first 2 seasons are good, but you still have the first season where Karen is not Karen.
Right.
And she's not Karen until season 2, really. And that is part of this.
Yeah, and I don't want to begrudge a show finding its footing because I do think that like that is a natural part of the process, but I do think that Cheers knew what it was fairly early and it stuck with that and like knew the strongest points of it, whereas kind of to the point that Jen made, Will and Grace kind of evolved a couple times and at times leaned into things that made it a little bit weaker. I don't know that Cheers ever did that. Like it had a good number of guest stars, but it wasn't guest stars that detracted from the chemistry of the main cast, whereas Will and Grace, when that main character or that guest star came in, like that was the thing, and you don't even remember what the rest of the episode was about.
Correct.
So, I think in terms of like overall strength of being what it was, and consistency in staying what it was, Cheers is stronger than Will and Grace.
I would argue the same.
Okay, so I think we're 3 to Cheers, 1 for Will and Grace. All right, so next up in a matchup virtually nobody on our panel saw coming, it's 1-seed Friends versus 4-seed Designing Women. I will explain why we need to pivot our votes and push Friends to the Elite 8. Who wants to make like a strong sugar baker woman and explain why tonight is the night that the lights go out at Central Perk, which means who wants to stump for Designing Women? I actually don't have anyone down to do this in our panel.
I was just going to say, I think it's Friends. I hate to say that. And I'm not always on the Friends side. Like for all of us, like Designing Women was at its weakest and
in the 90s. Correct.
Yeah. And like Friends is the 90s. So I hate to say this to us because as a group, like I know we've talked about the flaws of Friends, but like I think it's Friends, arguably.
Yeah. Jen, are you also on Team Friends?
I am. I know we talked about it in part 1, but I feel like in hindsight, thinking about the 90s, like the Rachel haircut, the Phoebe's smelly cat, like there's so much that's so 90s and just the whole, I don't think it's just a juggernaut. Like, I don't think any show kind of epitomized the 90s other than maybe Seinfeld, but
maybe. And I think we may be beginning there. Amma, where are you on this one?
I acknowledge it as an inevitability. Like, there's not a strong enough case to be made for Designing Women to fight it, but also, like, I've been very vocal about Friends not being the one I would pick. I will do so again in just a moment. But I acknowledge it as an inevitability.
And here's the thing. We say it's inevitable, but in virtually every other episode we've done with discussed Friends goes out by round 2. I don't think it has ever made it past round 2 on any topic, whether it be TV theme song or sitcoms of the 2000s. Like
I remember it getting knocked out in theme song, and people were shocked that happened, but it needed to happen. And I think this is finally the place where you acknowledge, like, you know what? There is a reason that Friends is what it is, and I think this is the place where that bears itself out.
I agree wholeheartedly, and it was like 90% of my argument, but I'm going to save that for round 3 because we are moving it ahead. And then finally in round 2, a battle of 2 quintessential 90s sitcom projects for Fox, 6-seed Living Single versus 2-seed The Simpsons. Amma is currently, single in her supportive living. Kevin, explain why even after all these years, it's still Homer at the bat for The Simpsons. And I'm going to have Amma go first.
I didn't know where that sentence was going, where you're like, she's single. And I was like, yeah, but like, come on, be cool.
Don't be all uncool. Be cool.
Exactly.
All is this to say, I didn't know where the sentence was going. So I was like, let me just wait. Let me see what happens. So I've been in prior rounds very clear about my love for Living Single. My love for Living Single in direct comparison to Friends. My love for Living Single as like a concept for television overall. And when I think about it in direct opposition to The Simpsons. Like The Simpsons, yes, had its best years in the 90s, but there's a case to be made for The Simpsons being a 90s show and a 2000s show and a 2010 show. And from what it looks like, it's going to end up being a better part of the 2020s as well.
And an 80s show, too. I'm pretty sure it started in the 80s.
It did. It started in the 80s,
99.
but I think like by our reasoning, it's less an 80s show and more 90s, 2000s, 2010s. And again, like, not to diminish the idea that its best seasons did happen in the 90s. That is true. The best Simpsons seasons were in the 90s. The best episodes took place in the 90s. But yeah, there's just something that wants me to stump for something that happened like in the 90s and was like a very specific flashpoint and was the progenitor to a lot of other really great Black shows that showed friendship. So like if we don't have Living Single, you don't get something like Insecure. You don't get even some of the, like the other like sketch shows and things that happen like lend a great deal to Living Single and the success that it had. So it just feels like I want to give it the recognition for like what it did for like Black TV. And I say this as someone who like loves animation. I'm very clear about that. But The Simpsons, I think, covers too much ground to take it over in this particular round.
It's that is the best argument I've heard against The Simpsons, and you've made some great arguments for The Simpsons in the past. So I take my hat off to you for that. Kevin, talk to me about Simpsons.
So here's the thing. And I am not always, Eric will always admit that I am not the biggest Simpsons fan in any of these brackets because, well, and I shouldn't say that I'm not the biggest Simpsons. It's hard to pin it down. And I think that's its genius in and of itself. Like it is in the 90s, a show that literally transcends things in a way that we don't think about anymore. And I think that's my own cross to bear, if you will. Like after the 90s, The Simpsons is, for me, almost kind of a non-entity. Like it doesn't necessarily do anything for me, but in the 90s, it is a peak sitcom for me. It hits every mark. The Who Shot Mr. Burns, the monorail, like all of these moments were quintessential sitcom moments, for a lack of a better term. Like, do you define a cartoon as a sitcom? I think it is the quintessential cartoon of the cartoon sitcom of the 90s. And it really defined comedy and what comedy can do for the future. And like, I hate to vote against Living Single because I think Living Single is excellent, but The Simpsons is iconic. And what it did in the 90s, I mean, I remember my cousins could not watch The Simpsons in the 90s because their parents thought it was too irreverent.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and that was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And it, I guess it was. And I remember my parents laughing and being like, they're idiots. Like, really? Like, what the hell? Like, what is this? It's just a cartoon. Like, who cares? But I think what that shows you is, and I mean, oh my God, I can't. I mean, we've got another Kelsey Grammer show, but like the Sideshow Bob of it all. And like, it brought pop culture moments like Cape Fear and other pieces of things to the forefront. And it was just so incredulously genius in how it took what would have been potentially a live action sitcom moment and made it incredibly special. And I think in the 90s it did it best. Outside of the 90s, I would say no.
Sure. Yeah, I agree.
It did not do that. But in the 90s, my God, it was spectacular.
Yeah, Jen, where are you on this one?
I also am going to vote Simpsons. I was a huge Simpsons fan when it came out, and I think we wouldn't have Family Guy or Bob's Burgers without the Simpsons.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Or like, Futurama or King of the Hill.
All of that, like that specific humor, and I feel like I still remember phrases from that show, and my mom did not care what I watched, literally did not care. So I was in love with it, and I was like, I know some people were like, don't have a cow, man, or like the underachiever for Bart Simpson. I was like wearing those t-shirts to school. My mom did not care. Like, she just was like, oh, okay, whatever, you like that thing. I just was like, it's so funny in a way that like I hadn't seen up until that time. Like, I feel like the cartoons I watched growing up were not that kind of humor.
They weren't. Yeah, it was a completely different level of humor for a cartoon show, which while Kevin was talking, I was thinking, had we had a cartoon sitcom prior to this, we had the Flintstones, I would consider to be.
Yeah, like Flintstones, Jetsons, but like for a long period, there wasn't anything like this.
And then this came along, and in the early seasons, it wasn't at the level it was by like when you got Conan O'Brien in the writer's room, and Al Jean, am I correct with that name? I think that's
Al Jean, Mike Reiss.
Well, and even when you want to talk about the Flintstones, like the Flintstones was a Honeymooners,
sure,
like, and the Simpsons was authentically itself, like, and its own thing, and it really took off in a way that was really special in the 90s. And I think it represents something very different from a sitcom perspective.
It does, although at the same time you were saying that, and I was thinking it also really captured that 90s economic depression that many Americans were going through, the same way Roseanne did. But like, they're still living in it, and newsflash, we all are. But it really does speak to it. Like, I hear what Amma is saying about Living Single. If you didn't have Living Single, you wouldn't have an entire genre of Black comedy television. And that's so true. But literally, if you didn't have The Simpsons, I don't think we would have literally dozens of animated sitcoms. I don't think they would have existed. The Simpsons was a big swing for Fox, and it didn't necessarily was not going to be an obvious hit. And it didn't just become an obvious hit. It, like, you can go to the Simpsons theme park in Universal Studios and like, it is a self-sustaining machine at this point. I've used that phrase twice this episode, so I'm so sorry. I am myself a self-sustaining machine. I think I'm sticking with the Simpsons here, Amma, which unfortunately means that Living Single would go out. I'm very sorry.
Listen, I have been on the right side of this bracket more often than I ever am, and I am accustomed to being alone in my principles on things, so this territory, frankly, feels more familiar. I'm okay with it.
Familiar territory is a 90s sitcom thing, so I appreciate that we're staying in that pocket. With that said, that is the end of round 2. We're going to take a quick break because Uncle Joey told us to cut it out. We'll be right back after these messages. And we are back for round 3 of our best 90s sitcom debate. Whatever happened in the intervening minutes does not matter because we were on a break, Rachel. Now, before we get into the Elite 8 matchups, I want to ask my panel, how can people find you on social media? Don't forget to share your beeper number. Amma?
I am on Twitter and Instagram at Amma Marfo, and I also have a back archive and some new episodes coming of a comedy show on YouTube Live called Pantry Raid Comedy, where comedians tell their jokes and then they talk about a strongly held food opinion that they want to share with the audience.
Oh, can you share with me a food opinion that you're willing to share?
So my favorite from the first round of Pantry Raids was Cheerios in place of croutons on salad.
Oh.
What?
Yeah. Innovative, but I was told by the person who shared it, undeniably good.
I am baffled. I'm bewildered. I'm bejazzled. I'm going to have to give that some thought. Jen, what about you? What are your socials?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Chen Writer, because there's a million Jennifer Chens in the world, literally. And I'm going to plug my young adult book that is coming out next year in the summer. It's a young adult rom-com that I'm excited about, called Artifacts of an Ex.
And I was going to ask you about that too, so I'm glad that you beat me to the punch. We are all about raising our boats. Wait, it's raising tides.
Rising tides lift all boats.
Thank you. I'm not a sailor.
Ding, ding.
Although if I go to P-Town, Kevin, how about yourself?
So you can find me on Twitter sharing probably problematic opinions at ET Kevin's Mind. And you can find me throwing some thirst traps and fun things around on Instagram at Kevin_Dillon, Dillon, not Dylan. There's no Dillion, _23. And just like, let's go. Like, add me.
Slide into his DMs is what he's trying to say to you.
Please do.
Yeah.
They're open.
They are always open.
Yeah.
And you can find me at Eric Rezsnyak on Twitter and Instagram. That's ERICREZ as in zebra, S as in snake, N as in Nancy, YAK. Or you can just message at Great Pop Culture Debate on Insta or at culture_debate on Twitter. If you're not following us on Twitter, you should be. We do lots of fun stuff on there, including every Saturday. Our panelists share the things that they are obsessed about in pop culture that week. And we love to just share good things. Speaking of good things, we're going to move on to round 3 and our 90s sitcom Elite 8 before Sophia Petrillo hits us with one of her Sicilian curses. The Elite 8 is Fresh Prince of Bel-Air versus Full House, Golden Girls versus Saved by the Bell, Seinfeld versus Cheers, Friends versus Simpsons. I always like to take a step back, and I think that's a really good Elite 8. I am surprised we don't have any CBS shows on here, do we?
To the surprise of whom, though?
We're not 80.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Exactly.
Fair.
I don't know any CBS shows that I like.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry.
Designing Women would be the only one that I can think of from that time period.
Family Matters became a CBS show.
True.
And I remember that because at one point, a couple seasons before they made that move, they had a very specific joke about CBS. Like, somebody was watching TV and they were like flipping, and then like you hear them say like tonight on CBS, and then the characters watching just like fall asleep. And I was like, which was a great joke. But then to end up on CBS after that was funnier than the joke itself.
True. The indignity of it all. CBS, the Arby's of television broadcast stations.
We know me.
Listen, it's almost creamsicle shake season at Arby's, and I feel like they should be rewarded for that because it is a shining light on their otherwise unremarkable menu.
Also, Arby's, please sponsor us. So let's get on to these debates. First up, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air versus Full House. I'm going to go around the horn. Amma, where are you on this one?
Oh boy. Full House.
All right, I'm going to go to Jen.
I'm going to vote for Fresh Prince.
Kevin.
Fresh Prince.
I'm also voting for Fresh Prince, and I think it's because Full House may have been the cultural juggernaut, but I don't think it was ever really trying to do anything particularly interesting. And Fresh Prince actually had some actual cultural relevance, right?
Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a reason it's an ultimate number 1 seed here. So
that's a good point.
Yeah.
And we talked in the last round about, Full House had great careers for all of its cast members. Fresh Prince launched Will Smith. I mean, Will Smith was going to be fine without it, but it was kind of like his acting kind of breeding grounds to become the biggest Hollywood movie star of that decade and the early 2000s. So does that make it a better 90s sitcom? I don't know. But I think what's, to me, going against Full House here is that, yes, it's super easy to watch. It's very comforting. But like, even when Full House was popular, it was never truly like funny. Without laugh track, it would have been crickets. Am I wrong? Tell me I'm wrong.
No, you're right.
I don't think you are. I think like Full House was popular, but Fresh Prince was good.
Yeah,
correct.
That's where it is. So we will advance Fresh Prince. Next, it's Golden Girls versus Saved by the Bell. And let's just start with this. Jen, I want to get your vote. What do you got?
I'm going to be hated by everyone I know because everyone I know loves the Golden Girls, and I do too. I think I don't think I need to state it out loud.
I want you to state it.
Say it out loud, girl.
Sing out, Louise.
You
gotta say it.
Saved by the Bell.
I admire
Wild.
your dedication to
Wild.
sparkle motion. That's what I want to
Wild.
say right here. I do. No, I'm not even
Wild.
joking. I think, there is something to be said for having convictions and knowing that a lot of these convictions are based off of your deep, abiding love of Zach Morris.
Yeah.
I love that. I think
Jen, as the person that is regularly convicted to the point of isolation on the show, I respect the hell out of what you're doing.
I know that, like, my best friends, like, I feel like there's people in my life who are going to be very disappointed, and I'm sorry, but
Jen, this is your first episode, and let me just say, you wouldn't be a panelist on the Great Pop Culture Debate if you weren't disappointing someone in your life. So, welcome to the club. I'm going to go to Kevin. Which one are you going with?
I don't even know that there's a question around this. Golden Girls, even in its last 2 seasons, it was exquisite television. Golden Girls.
All right. I'm going to go to Amma.
I'm giving it to Golden Girls because, and again, like both shows did issue episodes, we'll say, and Golden Girls' issue episodes hold up real well.
Yes, they sure do.
And I don't feel that about Saved by the Bell.
Yes, and having rewatched a good chunk of Golden Girls and Golden Palace, which was a CBS spinoff, Golden Palace is not terrible and still the issues stuff pretty well. It's funny because at the time, the Golden Palace was absolutely excoriated by the critics, and I'm watching. I'm like, this show is not bad. Even in 2022, this show is not bad. So. Jen, I'm so excited. I'm so scared that Saved by the Bell is finally out.
Yeah.
But it had a great run. Next, it is Seinfeld versus Cheers. Ooh,
oh boy.
Yeah. Let's start with Kevin on this one.
It's Seinfeld. I mean, it is the best sitcom of the 90s. It is the one that had the longest lifespan of the 90s. It was the 90s, to be honest with you. Like it is just such a special show, like in many ways. And I could throw a marble rye up into your apartment, or I could name my child Seven, or I could shout Serenity Now, or I could list Festivus, or I could meet with the Soup Nazi, or I could go with Jackie Childs as my lawyer, or I could replace Jay Peterman, who is allegedly J. Crew, as the CEO, or I could have a big salad. I mean, I could go on and on forever.
You
baby.
could.
Like,
literally.
it is the 90s. It is.
All right.
Seinfeld.
Jen.
I also go with Seinfeld. I think that if I could rewatch that and still find it hilarious. And I also feel like it talked about sex without actually using explicit terms in a really, really funny way. Like the John F. Kennedy episode, the yada yada. Like, it was like that humor that was able to be on like NBC, but at the same time, like you understood what was underneath that.
Malva? Yeah. No, that's a great point. That is a very good point, Jen. I had not actually thought about that ever, but it's so true. Amma.
I'm giving it to Seinfeld. I think it has just a staying power that while Cheers was massive in its age and people do still talk about it, like Seinfeld is one of those ones that is both of its time and timeless, to the point where I believe I've said it on this program before. I will continue to say it. If It's Always Sunny ended with a shot-for-shot remake of the Seinfeld finale, that would be a beautiful way to end it. Like, that's how relevant it is, that like a whole other era of like buddy comedy could end the exact same way, and it would make complete sense.
That is so true. I don't know what Gus Van Sant is doing right now, but literally book him now to do these.
Oh my God, guess what? Eric, as you announce it this day, he's directing the new episode of Ryan Murphy's Feud.
Yeah.
What's the new feud about?
Truman Capote betraying his female friends.
Yes.
Which I believe is the most Ryan Murphy sentence I personally have ever said.
Yes.
You're correct.
I'm living, I'm dying, I'm brought back to life. That has nothing to do with the 90s sitcoms. I'm sorry, folks, but that is, I'm transported.
I love it.
We are going to have a theme party in which everybody shows up dressed as either Truman Capote or one of the many women that he betrayed. Take your pick. All right. So my on this one, I actually, this is not as hard as I thought it was when I first looked at this matchup, because as you mentioned, Cheers only had 3 seasons in the 90s. Seinfeld was basically the entirety of the 90s. When did it start? 91?
Thereabouts. I think they had 7 seasons, I want to say.
Yeah. So it was basically, I'm giving it to Seinfeld for that. This one's actually harder, which is Friends versus Simpsons.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Jen, where are you on this?
Oh dear.
I know.
I don't know on that one, because I feel like I'm torn on which one would I rewatch now. I don't know. I feel like older Simpsons, like you guys were all saying, like, was so good, and then at a certain point I just stopped watching it.
Yeah.
And I feel like Friends, until the very, very end, I still enjoyed. Obviously it ended, and The Simpsons is still going, so I'm going to go with Friends.
Okay. I will argue that that Friends did have some seasons that dipped, but to its credit, it came back, which a lot of shows are not able to do. But Friends would know when it was going off the rails, and they would get it together and bring it back. Kevin, where are you on this one? This is I think this is the toughest one in the entire thing.
I really do too. And I think I initially went with The Simpsons, but I think I'm going to go with Friends as well, because it is just genuinely such a 90s sitcom. Like, it is... what I honestly wish... Well, I guess I voted for The Simpsons over Living Single, but... it's...
You're killing me here, Smalls.
I'm going to go with Friends.
Okay.
I'm going to go with Friends.
Amma, what about you?
This being an audio medium, you cannot see my posture at the moment, which is just my eyes are closed, my head is in my hands, just like, this is very difficult. We've managed to narrow this down to 2 shows that have really significant cultural impact. Like, Friends and Simpsons, both in their own ways, were so big in the 90s and like transcended people that, like, you didn't watch Friends, but you understood what was happening, and it was like a big part of the cultural consciousness. And like, you didn't watch The Simpsons, but you understood who those characters were. So it was massive. The rewatchability factor was mentioned a moment ago, so I'm going to use that as my deciding factor here, which is to say I practically never go back and watch Friends. Like, if it's on and I'm like at a hotel or somewhere that has cable, I'll watch it, but I never seek it out, whereas I will regularly go back and watch this particular era of The Simpsons. Like, if somehow I've decided there's no other TV for me to be watching, don't know how, there's simply too much, but sometimes that's just what I'll pick, and I'll go back to those. So for me, with the understanding that I believe Friends is going forward anyways, I'm still going to speak up for The Simpsons on this one.
With 2 votes, Friends would go forward no matter what, because if it was a tie, it's a 1 seed. Simpsons is, I think, a 4 seed.
Yeah.
So Friends would advance. I will say this on behalf of Friends, and I do think I am going with Friends here. The Simpsons, we made this comment a lot in the Boy Band episode, where like something transcends, like the Beatles are technically a boy band, but by saying they are the best boy band almost diminishes what they are, which is the best rock band of all time. The Simpsons is a 90s sitcom, but to call it simply a 90s sitcom is diminishing the fact that it is an iconic, like, cornerstone of television, an entire like genre, animation, comedies, primetime, right?
Yeah.
Even with its sad legacy now, Friends is, I would say, definitively a 90s sitcom. Yes, it spilled over into 2000s, but its cultural power and meaning is deeply rooted in the 90s and being a sitcom. And it was, you could say that Seinfeld, and we are potentially about to get to this actual argument, supersedes it in the area. But I think in terms of broad cultural awareness and appealing to a younger group as well, Friends has an edge there. So I am going to give it to Friends, also because I think a Friends versus Seinfeld Final Four matchup is a hell of a lot more compelling than a Seinfeld versus Simpsons.
Yeah.
So that gives us Final Four: Fresh Prince versus Golden Girls, Seinfeld versus Friends. Okay. Those are all NBC shows. Am I wrong? I think they're all NBC shows.
They
Way
sure
to
are.
go.
Yep. There you go. Okay. I'm going to start here. Kevin, Fresh Prince or Golden Girls?
Golden Girls.
Amma.
Oh, God. Oh, wow. Fresh Prince.
Jen.
Also, French Prince. I know that everyone's hating.
No.
I'm not gonna hate. It's okay because I love Fresh Prince. So
And
I'm gonna go for it.
Here's my out for you. Which of these two shows is, I think, a better show? It's Golden Girls. And as a gay man, I'm legally obligated to say that.
Mhm.
However, if you had a gun to my head and said, what decade does the Golden Girls take place in? My first initial thought is going to be the 80s. Even though there are seasons in the 90s. How many seasons in the 90s, Kevin? 2?
Yeah.
Yeah. It still even feels like the 80s. And I do think like the late 80s, early 90s are almost a decade onto themselves in my mind. But I think it really is more an 80s sitcom. And if we have an 80s sitcom episode, which I hope that we will someday, I totally expect Golden Girls to win, honestly.
Yeah, 100%.
Or certainly Final Four.
And
Therefore,
again, like,
go ahead, Amma.
well, another point to kind of like assure Jen, I also think that Golden Girls to me is not unlike Frasier in the sense of like, regardless of the fashion, regardless of some of the other like visual hallmarks of it, you could make the same Golden Girls now and it would hold up great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Whereas The Fresh Prince, again, has been rebooted, but it has to be wildly different from what it was. So going back to the idea of the 90s-ness of it helping drive these decisions, that can be a piece of this to consider as well.
I love that argument. Kevin, I believe we are 3 for Fresh Prince, 1 for Golden Girls. Are you going to be
That's
able to live
fine.
with that?
Yeah.
I don't think you care because you have your right-hand side of the bracket. So speaking of which, it's Seinfeld versus Friends, our must-see TV juggernauts. Did Seinfeld pass the torch to Friends? Is that the way that worked?
No, they overlapped by a couple of years.
They overlapped?
They did overlap, but
Okay.
Seinfeld was first.
Yes.
Seinfeld was first, yes.
Was Friends on at 8 and Seinfeld at 9?
I think so. I feel like that sounds right. I also I feel like Seinfeld didn't get its footing and like popularity until later.
Yeah,
Correct.
It barely got renewed for season 2. It was
we
not
very nearly did
successful.
not get it back.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start with Amma here.
Seinfeld.
I'm going to go to Jen.
I'm going to say Seinfeld as well because I think it's the humor still stands.
Kevin, I know you're Team Friends.
No, I'm Team Seinfeld. Hands down. Yeah.
Go ahead. You're going to say something?
Nope.
Okay.
Seinfeld.
I've been stumping hard for Friends this whole time, and I do think that this is its time to bow out because it was huge. And one of my main arguments for Friends was I do think it's a funny show. A lot of people will be like, Friends isn't funny, and it's very kind of knee-jerk to dismiss it. But I do think it is a funny show. But Seinfeld goes beyond funny. Seinfeld was fucking genius.
Yeah.
There is stuff in there that is like comedic gold. It's gold, Jerry. It's gold. And as much as I love Friends...
Oh, thanks, Penny Banya.
Seriously, as much as I love Friends, I don't think it ever quite hit gold. I think it was, rhinestones. No, that's a terrible comparison. God, I'm firing myself from this podcast. But you know what I mean. It was never quite there. It's Hanukkah Gelt. That's a better comparison.
There we go.
Okay, so that gives us a Seinfeld versus Fresh Prince final 2, which I think they were all 1 seeds, but
oh wow,
yeah,
They were.
All right, I'm going to start with. Well, Kevin, you're kind of an obvious one. You're going with.
Oh my God! If any of, I hate to say this, it's Seinfeld. It is the best sitcom of the '90s, hands down.
Jen.
I'm gonna also go with Seinfeld again because I mean, you could quote any episode. Also, that cast together was just
incredible.
Genius. I mean, I still remember when like Lane sent out the holiday card with her nipple. And like George was so mad, and then she's like, "Do you want to see it?" And then she just like pushes his face, and I'm just like, it's hilarious. It's still
Jen,
hilarious.
can I tell you my other favorite is when she rips his hair off of its head. I don't like this, and here's what I'm doing with it. And she throws it out the window, and she just like slaps her hands together. It's incredible.
God.
I will say though, for like Julia Louis-Dreyfus, I feel like her 90s looks were just, I was like, she's such a cute person, and yet she's wearing all these awful 90s outfits. Because then in Veep, I'm like, oh my God, you're beautiful.
Yeah, it's like, this is how you should have been dressing the whole time.
But they liked women to look like linebackers in the 90s. It was a thing. I can't explain it.
Listen, that's where our power came from until we got closer to closing the pay gap. Like, I don't know what you want.
Shoulder pads or equal pay, ladies. You got to pick one. Yes. And 90s women
can you pay us regularly? And they're like, best we can do is shoulder pads.
Exactly right. Exactly. What about you, Amma?
I mean, I'm giving it to Seinfeld. It's transcendent. Like, Fresh Prince is wonderful for what it was and what it is and what it continues to be now, but Seinfeld was like such a moment in time that exploded, and it's everywhere, and it continues to be everywhere, and it's undeniable.
Here's what's funny about Seinfeld, and I'm also going with Seinfeld here, so it is unanimously winning, but Jerry Seinfeld is by far the least interesting and the least important part of that cast.
So much so.
He is a schlub. And even when it was on, I was like, why is this show Seinfeld? When, like, clearly he's the least interesting and compelling character on this program. But I don't know if it would have worked if you had a lead who was like fighting for camera time. That's essentially what you get with Always Sunny, right? Like, those are 4 equal characters, each of them fighting for the spotlight. Yeah. And Seinfeld, you have this like complete meh, the unflavored ice milk of sitcom heroes, right? And then you have these 3 like burning furnaces of dysfunction just like raging around him. That's great television. Like, there's an alchemy to that cast, and it wouldn't work if you had anyone with any kind of actual charisma to him is the lead character.
Well, and Jen, to your point about like it being able to talk about sex without explicitly talking about sex, I cannot fathom having to listen Jerry Seinfeld talk about sex. That sounds horrifying. So I think you don't really have a choice.
Yeah.
Really, any of them, though. Can you imagine any of them? Even Julia Louis-Dreyfus, I can probably give a pass. But like the rest of them, and I mean, listen, when you look at that cast, Jason Alexander's still working. He's on Maisel now. Julia Louis-Dreyfus has achieved her like actual like iconicness status. She will always be with us. Julia Louis-Dreyfus will always be working and doing amazing things. Michael Richards is done, and he
did that to himself. He did it to himself,
and he had every reason to be done, and he will never not be done. He, like in the immortal words of Carrie Bradshaw, he's so over. We need a new word for over. But like, it didn't tarnish Seinfeld. Seinfeld is still unimpeachable. And I think it is the correct choice for the best 90s sitcom. So there you have it, folks. Our pick for the best 90s sitcom is indeed Seinfeld. Do you agree? Do you think we should be sentenced to a year in jail and never have contact with each other again? Tell us how you really feel by leaving a comment on this episode at greatpopculturedebate.com or finding us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. While you're there, make sure that you subscribe and follow the podcast so you can hear about what new debates are coming up, vote in open polls, and even decide what topics we tackle next. I want to say thank you to my panel, and to you I say TGIF, which actually means thank God it's finished, because if you're listening to this episode, it took us like literally 3 months to get this one done.
My God.
It has been a journey. So thank you. And thank you for listening. If you loved what you heard, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you can get even more exclusive content and you can get episodes a whole day early. So we hope you have a good one. fun. And remember, everyone is entitled to their wrong opinion.